We are live, we are back. We are minus, well, one member had pick up children. And here comes the rest of the committee with ice cream.
It's the ice cream crew. Oh, we're live.
Okay, we are back. And we are going to 220. This is, yes, the education funding spending in fiscal year 28 and 29. This is the bill that proposes to cap the increase, not cap increase based on present school spending. So if you're a high spender, you can't spend more than 3% per student more. If you're a low spender, you can go up to 9% per student more. So it's not free, but it's a limit on the increase. Thought being that we are working towards the foundation formula and some restructuring, but next year we are not, according to all projections, going to have $100 million to buy down the tax rate as we have. This will be our third year. Plus, if we agree, the governor's budget proposes to remove the $50 million in $10 million annual increments from the education fund and move it to the transportation fund. This was money that was added. It was increased in order to help pay for Act 60. This is not money that wasn't stolen from transportation. If that happens by next year, there will be a $20 million and probably no general fund money to backfill that. The year after it will be 30. So we have yet to approve that. I don't know if we will, but that is the proposal that's on the table. So we're trying to get a handle and to bridge this once, and if we get to a foundation formula, schools will be given a set amount per student with weights and all kinds of other bells and whistles, but there will be a set amount. You won't be able to vote to spend $25,000 a student and then have that go into the ed fund and everybody else in the state help pay that cost. So that's where we are. And we went through the bill last Friday, I think, and there was concern that, especially in small schools, because this involves weighted pupils, that if you lost one or two pupils that came with several weights, they were poor, they had a disability, and they spoke English as a second language, they lose that one student as they move. Could have a significant impact if you're a small school. So we were looking for that cost per student, or I thought it was capping your overall budget or spending in that, but two things. And then because we recognize that we can't predict all things, like your furnace might die, and require you to make a substantial investment kind of thing. We asked to have an appeal put in there to the Secretary of Education or designee or something, but to have there be an appeal process. So, John, we've set you and Julia, I don't know.
I think we're going to both come up with that's okay. Just,
okay.
I wasn't going to start with language because I think it's still completely clear.
Beth is here to make sure we stay legal and follow education law, jot down tax law. Let's see where we go. Okay.
Hello, John Gray, I'm the Chief Legislative Council.
Julia Richard, AFO.
So I'm just gonna say things, but I think we had a question from the last discussion, which was about addressing this declining student enrollment, and there's been a proposal related to giving the greater ed spending versus the per pupil spends that you would get, and this was meant to account for the fact that if you had declining enrollment, then you wouldn't be entitled to have the same overall education spending, which is intuitive just because the per pupil figure that you would get would be increased as a result of the decline in student count. So we understood this in, I think, slightly different ways as to what you might be requesting.
I mean, we were totally clear at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon.
That's right. And so one question is just to get clarity on what the desired goal is here. I've drafted something that tries to get at the technical difficulty is that you can't just outright compare education spending against per pupil spending, because ed spending will always be a greater literal nominal number than your per pupil spend. So we need an apples to apples comparison, which means you need to either compare ed spending versus ed spending, or per pupil spending versus per pupil spending. And so I have a draft that focuses on per pupil spending and kind of artificially creates a way of comparing last year against this year that protects against student pupil count decline, basically. But there's another understanding which might be simpler, and I don't know if you want to offer them.
Sure. So, to John's point, we have since we were in here on Friday, John and I have been meeting to try to figure out the different ways to go about this. The other idea of how it could be interpreted is to look at the greater of, looking at the education spending that would be permitted under the allowable growth calculation, or the prior year's education spending increased by inflation. Whichever is greater is what you're capped at. So looking at the aggregate education spending figure.
So totally different, they produce different effects. One is, I think this is a much simpler one to describe. It's just last year's inflated versus the standard allowable growth percentage determination that you've already seen in the draft, or kind of a targeted approach at student enrollment decline. And I will just offer that if we get to the point of showing language, because this may just be a discussion about what you guys are trying to do, and then I can go back and put something together. But if we get to the point of looking at language, I can also talk about an alternative way to draft what I've done that changes it from being about per pupil spending to being education spending. So there's different ways to do it. But I think the first question is this difference between just high level approach.
The inflation rate, I think sometimes we use like the education inflation rate, or so I can't remember what it's called. NIFA, yeah.
Typically in Title 16, it's NIVA, so the National Income Products Account inflator for state and local government expenditures and gross investment.
Okay.
Like the total. Usually we just refer to it as NIFA.
Do you know what it has? Do you know what it was this year or is this year?
So I can send the state economist forecasts it forward, and it is produced by BLS. And the NIFA from 26 to 27 is 2.8%. So that's what I've applied here, absent a different decision.
26 to 27.
Correct. So FY 26 to FY 27. And the reason that I've included that is because I was trying to calculate the difference in savings under the different constructs. And as you'll recall, when we spoke about S220, one of these times, and we talked about the estimated savings of 67.5 million, that was referring to, if this were to happen in FY 27, what do we estimate it would save? Because we don't know FY 28 budgets.
Okay, so if we the 2.8 would be applied to the total education spending. Not to the per pupil spending. It would be, and that would be the greater of the two of those, the per pupil long-term weighted average. Or the amount that you generate by for NIPA.
The way we were talking about it is I think the inflator would only be applied to a whole ed spending. So that's
Yeah.
the simple comparison is prior year ed spending inflated or your allowable growth.
Whichever is greater on a total dollar basis.
Aggregate basis.
An aggregate.
So it's, the ed spending increased by inflation. That is, silent to long-term weighted pupil counts and how they may or may not change. That doesn't matter. Where the per pupil spend or the change in the long-term weighted average daily membership does matter is for calculating that allowable growth amount.
Is there a way to do the aggregate one in a sort of sliding scale like the per pupil one is, the 3 to 9%?
So it is that. So the way that, and this is all this is how I interpreted the conversation to be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to
Your
be this
brain
way.
is super helpful, Julia. So that's why I'm trying to understand what you're thinking, how you're thinking about it.
Thank you. So the way that I'm thinking about it is we're going to talk first about allowable growth, how that's calculated. So that maintains the original calculation that exists in S220, where it's got the floor of 3%, and then it slopes up to 9%, inversely related to the per pupil spend. So that's calculated. And then that's multiplied by the prior year's per pupil spend to get the current year's allowable per pupil spend. And then when you take that allowable per pupil spend and multiply it by the long-term weighted membership of that year to get the aggregate, how much allowable education spending is there. So the slope and the floor and all that still exists within the allowable education spending. And then we take that and we say, okay, we just calculated this for everybody. Now we're going to look at everybody's prior year ed spend and increase it by inflation. And if your ed spend increased by inflation is greater than your allowable growth, you can have your ed spend increased by inflation as your cap. If your allowable growth is greater than your prior year ed spend increased by inflation, then you get your allowable growth. So it results in less savings because it creats more capacity for school districts. Do you agree with all of that?
How
Yeah,
much less, can you quantify that, Julia?
So preliminary estimates, this is if it were to be applied in FY27, the preliminary estimate for the S220 as originally drafted was 67.5 million, which I testified to. And then the preliminary savings of this construct that I just spoke to using the NIPA 26 to 27 is an estimated savings of 57 million. So a little bit of 10 million less in NIPA savings. John, would you add anything?
I think that's what we were talking about.
Okay, I've drafted several things and that is not one of the things.
The conversation we were having is, we were talking about at least allowing them to spend at the same education spending that they had the year prior.
Yep.
Right.
We didn't have, the idea of the NIP on top of that is new.
So I have something that is like that. That is, but we can do any of these things.
Okay,
It's fine.
what do you have?
What I have is kind of that description. It would grant you if it would result in a higher budget for you, higher ed spending to use last year's ed spending. Because you had a student enrollment decline, you could use that. It doesn't involve any inflating of last year's figures. It's just, the simple way to describe it is it's an alternative way to have a hold harmless provision, basically. It basically says you can use the friendliest student count, either this year's or last year's, to determine the per pupil spend. And I don't want to just in terms of it determining the impacts, I think you would also looked at this piece.
Yeah, so the way,
I don't know if you felt
the change in savings seems to be negligible when looking at,
Those two.
the parameters or the calculation that John just laid out compared to S 220.
So the way that Julia described it was more in sort of keeping with what I was trying to describe last week. Was it Friday?
That's right.
Because I think that if we just allow them last year's amount, that doesn't account for the increase in sort of inflation costs, like contracts and oil and all the things that go up in price. But if we just do it on a per pupil basis, the long-term weighted average basis, it doesn't take into account changes in enrollment or changes because of data problems. Like we talked about the poverty data from the federal government probably being really, really messed up. And so districts could be punished for bad data that's not their fault when they do it on a long-term weighted average basis. Or the loss of students who are heavily weighted students, as we've talked about. So I think that the option that Julia mentions gets more at what I was getting at. Granted, that's not what I suggested, but she's thought about a lot more than I have. So I think it gets at it. It is. Yeah, and I mean, I just also want to reiterate that the new data that we got last week shows overall budgets going up by 3.5% this year. So they are fairly close to that right now. You know, they're not going out and, you know, buying gold mugs.
Yeah, I agree with what Senator Hardy was just saying, and I like what you're saying, and I'm wondering if you'd agree with this way of framing the Julia. No.
I don't want to go that, to be clear.
Fair enough.
This is ours.
Yeah,
When
sure.
it comes out of here, we.
But I appreciate that.
Indeed. You're not partisan. All right,
Not
so
partisan.
non-partisan. All right, so I think what I heard you say is that if this were to go into effect, tell me if you agree or disagree with this. All school districts would by default, all school districts would not be able to spend higher. Would not be able to have their aggregate spending higher than their NIPA adjusted amount unless their pupil count increases, allowing the higher allowable growth amount to proportionally allow for a higher aggregate budget. We would be effectively capping the growth for everybody at that NIPA rate unless their pupil count allows them a higher growth percentage. Is that incorrect?
I think it's slightly different than that, which is that the comparison of the NIPA inflated factor against what you would get under allowable growth isn't. Allowable growth captures more than just pupil count, right? It's a determined percentage based on last year's spend of the relative difference of your district against the highest spending district. So we can't just say outright that it will be the case that you only get allowable growth if your pupil count increases. It could be that your allowable growth determined, like if you are a relatively low spending district and you get a 9% allowable growth percentage, so that could result in greater flexibility for you. So it's slightly more complicated, but you're on the right line of thinking.
I think
And if I may, I think the other, absolutely, everything John said. And the other piece that I would add, and I think you said this, but I want to be clear that we're talking about education spending, not school district budgets or school district spending on education, which are different, right? The education spending is the total budget minus offsetting revenues. And that's how we get to our education spending.
And I'm just trying to think of this simply. In S 220 as introduced, there is a ceiling for every district. Okay, and all we're talking about here is having a second ceiling. And the district can spend up to the higher ceiling if they want to. If they want to.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
That's all we're doing. That's all
and
we're
the higher ceiling is the NIPA inflation rate.
Well,
It could be,
It could be.
some, it depends on the district.
On the
It could be
district,
for
yeah.
people, if they,
education spending,
Yeah.
it could be education spending plus NIPA, it could be something else.
But NIPA is coming in pretty,
2.8.
yeah, it's coming in fairly well, okay.
If they want to, is important. This is not saying they're gonna get this much money to spend. This is, they can go up to that amount or less if they so desire in the current state.
right. Can I just ask, I mean, John, if I can put you on the spot, so when you first introduced this bill, you did express some concerns
Yes,
with the potential constitutionality of it, and I'm wondering if you could reiterate those in the context of this
for sure.
proposal.
So the way that I express the constitutional concerns will not vary much based on the way that we design the cap. I would say it's largely just a function of there being an outright cap. And I think the basic point I was trying to make is that under the education clause, the state is obligated to provide an education to its students. There's a constitutional obligation there. If the cap was such, and I'm not saying that it is, but if a cap was set such that school districts could not adequately fund education for their students, then you could have a claim that you violated the education clause. It's really that simple. We don't know empirically what that number is. In this case, you can say things like, we're determining the cap on the basis of prior spending, which is presumably reflective of the amounts that school districts deemed appropriate. So that's one concern, is under the education clause. There's additionally a concern under Brigham, which is about substantial quality of educational opportunities. And I think a simple way to think about the concept here is just that you're literally setting differential caps, varying caps for different districts based on their prior spending, right? So a low spending district can spend up to X amount. That's their allowable growth cap. And a higher spending district can spend up to a different cap. Now, there was an equity factor that went into the determination of those caps. They're inversely related to prior year pupil spending, but it is literally the case that some districts by law will be allowed to spend more than others. The thing I would say to try to complicate this even more, to give unhelpful lawyerly speak, is that you could imagine, I'm just going to give a hypothetical. You could imagine a law that says your lowest spending districts can spend no more than $1 million per pupil. And then you didn't apply that same limitation to the highest spending district. So by law, you have in place a cap only on low spending districts and not on high spending districts. But I'm guessing, and we don't know, but I would guess that no one would particularly care that you impose this $1 million cap on the lowest spending and not on the highest, because no one spends $1 million on their pupils. So the point is just, I'm trying to draw, it's an empirical question. And, but I think there are potential concerns under both. It's not to say that either is resolved in the situation, but just so you guys are aware.
Is the fact that this is 2 years at all mitigating, and the fact that we're putting an appeals process into this so that if you in fact can't hire a math teacher,
Right.
you have an appeals process to go through.
Yeah.
Would that mitigate that concern at all?
So to answer both questions on the 2-year piece, the constitutional obligation persists regardless of the temporal duration. It may be the case that it's more difficult to bring a successful challenge within a 2-year period, but the constitutional obligation exists nonetheless. So during to your point about the appeals process, I think it would likely depend a lot on how the appeals process goes, but I certainly, advising on this front, feel much more comfortable when you have an appeals process built in, because that's basically the granting an avenue to say, someone can say, and I can show you the language if we end up getting to that point, but I don't want to, I know this is a complicated discussion, but basically the language is saying something like, you would submit your budget to the Secretary of Education if the budget necessary for your schools needed to exceed the allowable growth that was set for your district. So it's literally an appeal on the basis that to adequately fund your education, meaning a higher level of growth. So if the appeals process works, it's reflective of actual costs. That makes me feel better as the lawyer, but, so I think it is something that boosts the ability to withstand constitutional challenges, if that's the question.
Okay. And we haven't gotten to the, we just said an appeals process, but I gather you have a draft.
I have, and it really is, yeah.
Senator Beck, you have a question?
No, no.
Okay, Senator Hardy.
I have a question. One, so when we already have a, excess spending threshold that above which districts get doubly taxed if they go above it. But that, the constitutional concerns on that are less because it'll
It's
still
a
allow.
threshold.
It's a,
Right, it's
Yeah.
a threshold rather than, so the same concerns of. Yeah, I would say a threshold. Is different than a cap in terms of, if you just think about the education flaws concern, right? Someone's incapable of.
It's a tax threshold, not a spending.
okay, and so one of the conversations we had last week was, could we do the same thing with using the excess spending threshold, just lower that a little bit, and it would still, and I don't know if you looked at those numbers at
I
all.
haven't had a chance to look at those numbers yet. I can follow up with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how interested others are in that, but we already have a mechanism, so this is introducing some other complex mechanism.
That just change a number.
Pardon me?
Excess spending threshold, just change a number.
Yeah.
Done.
Really easier to draft.
So, yeah, so I guess that if you were interested in looking at a change the excess spending thresholds, the question then is to what? From right now, right, the excess spending threshold is that FY 25 average per pupil spend, excuse me, increased by inflation and then multiplied by the statutory factor of 118%.
Mhm.
If we were gonna model how it would look different, the first question would be, instead of what 118%, what percentage would you be using the calculator?
Right. And how would this impact tuition rates? There's,
This doesn't affect anything about tuition rates. This is just a cap. It's been-
We do have some amendments that are coming.
If I may, the further consideration that I would raise with respect to the excess spending threshold and the cap. And I think this is obvious. The cap literally is limiting how much education spending is
Yeah,
permitted.
hard cap.
And so we will know the maximum amount of education spending in the state. Adjusting the excess spending threshold, I won't be able to model how school district budget decisions will be impacted by a different excess spending threshold. Really, what I would be able to model is how the tax distribution would change across the state, right? Because by lowering the excess spending threshold, if we assume there's no budget changes, is what I would need to assume. That just means that certain districts are going to be paying more in taxes, which means other districts are going to be paying less in taxes.
the districts that are at or above.
The districts that are above the excess spending threshold will then be double taxed in the amount they're above. So they'll be making up a larger part of that property tax pie, meaning the other districts below the threshold will be making up a lower piece of the pie.
But we
Smaller
already
already.
know that it's easier for some districts to pay the double taxation than other districts, which is one of the reason we have low spending districts who I've heard it argued aren't able to pass a budget that adequately educates their kids. So we're kind of in a rock and a hard place there.
But if you do, if you bring that walk the excess spending threshold down. That does push the yield up. It makes it easier for those low spending districts to spend additional monies.
That's another way of saying what Julia just said, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. let's have John walk us through the appeals process, which is drafted. And then we can go back. I know starting
Yeah.
what we want to do, and we have two amendments.
So I will follow your direction. I think it is probably simpler if I just describe the appeals process, because the amendment I have contains the per pupil concept as against the NIPA inflated one. So it really is quite simple. It is just that if a school board determines that the budget that is necessary for the upcoming school year does not fit within the allowable growth, it submits its budget for a spending review to the Secretary of Education. And then, using a similar concept to what was used in Act 127 for the tax rate review, the Secretary of Education, with the assistance of 3 superintendents and 3 business managers, would then review each budget that's submitted for spending review and just ask the question, was this outside of the district's control? Or was there other good cause for increase in the ed spending of that district? They determined that there was good cause for the increase, then they would amend the district's allowable growth to permit them that good cause increase. It really is that simple. There's no factors built in. You may recall that there were factors for the 127 review process. They aren't applicable here because that's more about tax rate mitigation. So it really is just a simple Secretary of Education, with the assistance of these 6 professionals, would review each submitted budget. It would be a discretionary call by the school boards to submit those budgets, but they would review each submitted budget and then determine whether there was good cause for the increase in the ed spending and potentially amend that allowable growth for the district to permit the increase. The way the timing is currently set up in the draft, the limitation is now that a school, you may recall that the initial S220 draft just said you can't have education spending in excess of the allowable growth, right? So it was just a prohibition on having excess spending at a sufficiently high level. Now the draft is targeted at proposed budgets. So the restriction is school board cannot propose a budget that exceeds this. And so the idea contemplated is that if the school board determines that their budget would exceed the allowable growth, they then submit it to the Secretary of Education for review so that the budget they end up submitting to the voters can be reflective of what is necessary for the district. Yes.
Okay. Does that work for people? Okay. So we have the per pupil spend, the allowable growth cap as it was presented to us, along with whichever is greater, which would have less savings, your total budget with an increase according to the NIPA inflation rate, which this year was 2.8. All right, so or I'm trying to remember. Sean.
Yeah, mine is like, the concept is like a hold harmless.
It's okay, it's a greater spend either this year or last year. You can use either pupil count, which said if you lost your heavily weighted student or a whole family of heavily weighted students, you could use last year's per pupil spend.
There's another way to describe it that may be more intuitive to folks, because I get that the per pupil spend is maybe hard to wrap the mind around. When you think in terms of declining student enrollments and per pupil spend, you're protecting against that decline. So you're just touching the per pupil spending piece. But another way to think about it is that you could say that a district will get its allowable growth calculated based on the ed spending that they had last year, or if they had an increase in student count in this year, they would get an allowable growth that's determined based on last year's ed spend plus the per pupil spend in that year multiplied by the increase in student count. Right. So either way, the apples to apples creates, like, unfortunately technical sounding language, but that's the concept if you do that approach.
And now we've had the allowable growth cap put on the table and lowering that to what, 3%?
What do do you mean the excess spending
Excess
threshold?
spending.
That's a 118%.
Yeah, but the proposal, we have that now.
What's T, right?
So I thought the proposal was to lower that.
I don't know, if both
There
of
was-
it's a conversation.
Yeah, it was a
Okay,
conversation
that-
about whether we could use a current mechanism.
Do it that way.
Okay,
I'm kind of, as far as whether we want a, one test or two tests. I think if we're gonna have an appeal process, I would favor just going with the one test that's in the as introduced. And not, we're gonna do an appeal, if there's gonna be an appeal loop for this grant, I just go with that one test, but if you're not gonna have an appeal, so I think you do have to have multiple tests, but that's just me.
So on that point, I'd love to hear from the agency of education if they have a preference, because if they're worried that they're gonna get bombarded with appeals at an already busy time, then I guess I could be persuaded to that point. But if they at all say, what, it makes sense to do the NIPA thing, because we don't have the capacity to manage this budgetary.
Then we do two tests.
Then we do two tests.
Yeah.
I mean, I think also school districts know far better than the agency of education what their budgets should be and what is necessary to educate their students. So while I support an appeals process, I frankly trust districts far more than I trust the agency to be making these decisions. And allowing the NIPA gets away from the problem we have discussed with the per pupil spending data, the finding enrollment issue.
okay, so if we have two, the likelihood of having a lot of appeals decreases. I mean, right now, you got voters. I don't think we'd have to look too far to find school boards that don't feel they are be given enough money to educate their students because their voters are not voting to spend that money. That's essentially how we get the big swing in per pupil spending. So,
I just want to throw out that it may be the case that having two ceilings as described reduces the inclination to go to a few, but it may not meaningfully decrease the, like it could be that school districts still. There's a flood of spending reviews, right? Just depends what the needs are.
you don't know. Okay. Can we all live with? So I know we've got two amendments coming. Can we live with two-pronged test for the cap? The appeals process. And I think that's it, right?
When you say two-pronged, you mean the NIPA?
Yeah,
NIPA.
the NIPA and the. Is that something everybody can live with? Maybe not like.
The general construct, yes, I'm not sure about NIPA. I'm not sure about last year's net spending plus NIPA. I think that. I mean, for a district that is losing students and needs to make some decisions, that gives them a lot of upward per pupil spending increase. And I don't think that's really what they ought to be doing. I think they should.
2.8%. That's not that much.
But if they're in declining, most of us are in a declining weighted situation. They're basically gonna get more than NIPA on a weighted student basis, then. I just, by giving a NIPA, I think it's delaying some hard choices. It's the districts that are declining in size.
To your earlier point, it's just the cap, so they could spend less.
They could.
Yeah.
I could go somewhere between last year and NIPA, somewhere in between, but I think giving them NIPA is too much.
For every school. There's all, yeah, for every pool that has declining, you're gonna have one that has increasing. You have.
So they're gonna be fine.
I mean. It's, I don't know, we need to settle on something. This is a bridge, remember?
And in the short term, they're still gonna have their costs of the building, their teacher contracts, their bus contract. You can't turn around the ship that quickly, so this. You know, that's,
But they need to start.
but NIPA is the sort of like basket of goods inflator kind of thing, because they still have the same basket of goods.
Two things. One, I'm more comfortable with NIPA because of Julia's estimates of it only affecting possibly a 10 million reduction of the overall, possible anticipated 67 million. But what I would pick up on your concern with NIPA, it's if this continues, if this gets extended afterwards, these districts are going to keep defaulting to that NIPA amount continually, to the point where I don't think we'll ultimately accomplish putting some spending pressures on them. So I wonder if there's a way to allow for the NIPA cap and then having that somehow diminish in the following years. If they continue to hit the cap, would they get a?
This is only a
It's only
2-year
two
thing.
years.
Yeah,
It's only 2 years. And
Yes.
the idea is that we will begin with a foundation formula, which is a hard cap. You have a little wiggle room with a boat at the top. But it is essentially 48, it is a limit on what you can spend.
So on the cost. Long-term cost containment pieces, you know. As currently drafted, the bill is kind of. Well, it can't be in thought, it is agnostic as to what is happening with the education
Yeah.
system. But I would just point out that in FY 29. Act 73 is law and the foundation formula will be rolled out. And these provisions would be meaningless in FY 29 because you would be under the foundation formula. But you can think of this as a bill that says, whatever happens, thinking about a process for mitigating costs.
I think you
But just,
know
yeah,
that there's a lot how Act 73 is playing out, is being worked through this body, the two bodies, that every one of these bills has a long way to go. And that every one of them will probably be changed before we all get out of here. I think this is trying to give taxpayers some security that that we're going to put some limit. It's not going to stop going up, but we're going to stop the double digit going up for at least 2 years so that they can catch their breaths. I'm going to see if we can get more than 1 or 2 towns, but it's still a little early, but I really want to trace that tax delinquency thing before it is a real crisis. Because chance that some of those homes are going to get brought up and turned into short-term rentals is pretty good. And I don't think any of us want to see that happen.
Thank you. I'm not expressive enough with my hand raising.
No,
I
you're
have to
just
be-
in my blind.
I know, no, I have to be more expressive. I'm ever the optimist, and I would like to think that in tandem with this particular effort, we are also potentially doing our seesaws, and we're potentially also doing some strategic mergers, and we're doing reference-based pricing to bring down some healthcare costs. So the entire ecosystem will hopefully be responding in ways that will be beneficial over the next few years. That's my plea for optimism and hope. May I present my?
Well, I want to get this settled. And see if we can all live with, there may be some nose holding, but we can live with what we've got now, which is Julia's proposal
The committee's
The
proposal.
committee's proposal, once we vote, it is ours, Julia's numbers. Cause we don't do those. The drafting we have for the appeals process, which we used before. And I think that's it. It's a pretty simple little bill, which is a death knell. And now we have two amendments, and I have a feeling, is that why Beth's in the room?
Yeah, and
I thought so.
you have to, one take to go. You okay?
Oh, that's right. Julia's got a hard stop at 5, so we will let Julia go.
I can say the next steps.
Okay, we will listen to the two amendments that Beth has,
Can I get this? Julie?
and then we will decide what we want to do with those, and hopefully we can get this on the vote. I've got it tentatively scheduled for Thursday.
Okay, so would you like me to let my? Tomorrow.
Oh, I had it tomorrow.
I thought it was today.
Okay, no, well, not, that's when you told me
Oh,
an amendment, so, okay, so if we can do it tomorrow, we will. That all depends on drafters and stuff, getting things done.
Should be able to put, yeah.
Okay,
Great, so I'll just share some concerns I had over the weekend as I was thinking about this, that there was a potential with a cap to further degrade our public education system, although I hope that is not the case, but there is that potential. And so I was worried that as we're potentially sort of bringing down quality in our public education system, just because we're, pulling funds out of the system, that there might be a perverse incentive for independent private schools to sort of capitalize on that. And that was obviously a concern for me. So I wanted to make sure that independent schools were also going to have some kind of a cap on their tuition so that we didn't have that lopsided environment. And I also wanted to make sure that the taxpayer dollars that were going to pay for that tuition were not going for things other than education. Like, I didn't want them going for scholarships, for example, to draw kids out of our public schools, because we know we have some small schools that if they close, there will be a public school desert in that geographic area. And I think we should do everything we can to avoid that. So those were a couple of my concerns, and those did get very sort of eloquently placed into this amendment. And then my other concern just came from, again, personal experience with having to close our high school and having to now be building another one because of the PCB contamination. I was worried that, debt service and money that we owe on loans that we got through a bond would be part of our education spending, and that districts like mine would be punished for having that debt service. So I wanted to make sure that we address that as well. And I think John could probably speak to that. Yeah.
So let's do it. I'm gonna start because I have the first piece of this. It's gonna look a little funny because you haven't seen the underlying report of the Committee on Finance. But this is just for presentation reasons against the concept that you guys have been discussing today. So the first instance of amendment, this is using the same language that we use to exclude capital expenditures from the excess spending threshold. And so this is just adding to the allowable growth concept that when determining the ed spending against which you compare your allowable growth cap, right? You're subjecting that allowable growth cap. You would exclude from education spending voter approved bond payments toward principal and interest. So this would treat the allowable growth cap in a similar way to how we approach the excess spending threshold, and would exclude from education spending those bond payments.
and those bond payments are included in this year's.
Yeah.
So I can see that if you had to start making a bond payment next year, that it would inflate it. But if it is in this year's ed spend, it's already accounted for, right?
I think so. I just want to be careful if you're referencing the fact that post July 1, 2025, certain bond votes are included and others are not. So bond votes approved before a particular date. I think it's July 1, 2025, maybe 24, 24. Those are excluded from education spending for the purpose of excess spending in the first case. So that's based on when the bond was voted, not based on if they have it included in their budget this year. So I just want to be clear that was happening. In general, the concept of education spending includes your bond payments, if that is the.
That's, so if.
But we define, the way to think about it is we create technical concepts for particular pieces. So we say that for the purposes of the excess spending threshold, education spending excludes.
Right.
But the intuitive concept that people have is that education spending continues.
But if we're comparing both to last year's, unless you voted a bond
Yes, yes,
last year, and this is a new payment,
yes.
it's, in that case, I can see excluding it, okay? But if what I'm being told is I can't spend X more this year than last year, and last year I paid $1 million in a bond, a bond payment, then that $1 million is already in my base. I can spend that again this year, along with the 3 to 6% more, the 2.8 NIPA.
You're saying that those payments are already captured in the ed spending that is accounted for in the allowable.
Right, unless it was a bond voted last year, and I don't know if any were. But,
And even if they were, they would be part of your ed spending.
and spending, yes.
So that part is the excess spending threshold piece is not applicable to how this works here. It's just using a
Right.
similar method.
I mean, if we exclude it and you were paying $1 million last year in your budget, this year, if that $1 million is excluded, you can pay $1 million more in whatever and still stay under any cap.
Yeah, going along with the hypothetical, I think the way that I would state it is you would have a cap that is determined based on including bond payments within education spending.
Right.
And then you would exclude from the education spending that you are subjecting to a cap, those bond payments, which would then increase the amount that you could spend. I think that's what you're.
For some schools, but if I remember the treasurer in here, there wasn't much. Well, there were 3 Chittenden County schools that had issued bonds. Like in the last 20 years, there wasn't much out there in the way of bonded embedded. And those bonds are already let, so unless and to me, if your furnace blows up and you need to put X million into a new heating system, that's your appeals process. This is something beyond my control. We have another flood at Montpelier High School goes underwater. That's an extenuating circumstance. It's beyond my control. But just say we're not going to count bond proceeds that were in my per pupil or in my budget last year. From this year's school spending gives any school that has that a whole lot of wiggle room that other schools aren't getting.
I think what would make this work for me is if from the year over year, if we're talking about an increase in their bond payment. Like, I know that's kind of Burlington in
Yes.
that situation because you're building a school and it goes up a little bit.
It
every
goes,
year.
okay,
Whatever that delta is, I think that's fair game to exclude.
okay,
I'm not sure about the whole thing.
yeah, I mean, it's
The
already,
whole thing's excluded from excess spending threshold.
yes.
Yeah.
So a big chunk of our budget right now is paying off the building, right?
Yeah.
And the voters in our town, we knew that we would be paying more because we voted for that bond, because we needed a new high school. So the idea is, we don't want to be punished because we are paying off the debt on the building. Like, that's not going to education programming, that's not going to, that's going to paying off the loan.
Right, but that
It's part of your ed
paid
share.
last year.
Yeah.
Was figured in your ed spending. So this year, you've got that base. If we exclude what you paid last year, then you've got that, I don't know, 100,000 or $1 million to spend on other programs, which schools don't. Now, last year you paid $1 million and this year you owe $1.5 million. I think what Scott's saying is you leave out 5,
Yeah,
because that's
that's growth.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a contract that you have no control over. But to just say we're gonna leave out the $1 million.
Yeah.
And give you that much. I think that would get us into some legal trouble. And if your school gets contaminated this year, you have
That's
to
an appeal.
evacuate and stuff. That's where you do an appeal and get your rent from Macy's.
Yeah.
Or the Grange or whatever other towns.
So is there, sorry,
I'm just trying to think about this because. Can you just repeat the
Yep.
date, the prior to 20 what?
July 1, 2024,
Prior to July 1, 2024, it is,
voter approved bond payments for principal and interest are excluded, those bonds that are approved prior to that. The bond payments on a yearly basis are excluded from the excess spending calculation,
they're excluded from the excess spending calculation.
meaning that those costs are distributed more widely across the state rather than being double taxed within the district that has those bond
Okay.
payments.
And after that, they're not excluded.
After that, they're not for purposes of the excess spending threshold. There is an amendment there's a bill in the House that proposes to change this.
Okay. I'm just thinking of how, districts have all these building costs and some of them are because they need to make adjustments and changes to a building in order to, like in one of my districts, they're literally closing an elementary school and they need to make adjustments to the school they're moving all the kids to in order to accommodate all those kids. Plus, they need to make changes to the security systems in all the buildings because they're not meeting like current security needs. So these are not like frivolous building things. And in fact, one of them is in order to do what apparently we want them to do, which is to consolidate into fewer school buildings. So I'm just concerned that if we put too hard of a cap, this is a concern of mine about the cap in general, is if we put too hard of a cap on, they're not going to be able to do these things, which are necessary to do the long-term things that we're asking them to do in Act 73. So that's why I'm trying to find this flexibility in the cap, and this is one way of potentially doing that. But
Before,
yeah, so
on that point, before Julia leaves, really quick, on her way out, do you know of any idea of the total ed spending in Vermont last year? What amount would probably qualify as this type of voter approved bond payments? Is that a number that exists out there?
I do not know, and I haven't seen this before right now, so I haven't had a chance to think about it or look into it.
We could, as we did with excess spending.
Sorry to catch you.
Exclude any bond payments. Debt payments, so maybe you'll just go to your bank. Incurred for the next 2 years necessitated by building safety or efforts to consolidate. which would give you. And then there's the appeals process.
So just to be clear, in that case, you're talking about costs that otherwise would not be captured in the ed spending that you are using to determine your cap, meaning they emerged in FY 28,
Right.
basically.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
this is an add-on to what you spent last year, but it is necessitated either to enhance structural efficiency or safety,
Yeah, I mean, you can do something,
health and safety.
you could do something, and then there's different, there's different ways that you could do it. One is to exclude it from what constitutes education spending. Another is to add the dollar amount that corresponds to that to your allowable growth, and just say that your allowable growth is increased by the expenses you have that are related to merging and the like, right? So there's different ways to.
Should we let them do the other parts if she has to go? Like, we can maybe come back to this, I don't know.
Let's finish up that.
Okay.
And then. So John, do you have enough to draft? Something that would allow,
I have the first part of our conversation about NIPA and those things.
yes, I'm wondering, committee, about. Can we agree that we would allow not counting debt incurred in order to meet life safety or
So I shouldn't say.
or, yeah, school consolidation.
I mean, I really hope we end up paying for consolidation.
I think this, well, part of that is paying building costs.
Is building.
I think
Yeah,
this
that's a-
requires a little more conversation, actually, because I need to.
Let's get this one done and we'll put this on tomorrow for more discussion, if possible, though. And if you can think of some ways to,
I will think.
yeah. Everyone will think better in the daylight.
That's right.
Okay,
Beth St. James Office of Legislative Counsel, section 2, in this document. Introduces a tuition cap for fiscal years 2028 and 29. So notwithstanding 16 VSA sections 823, subsection 824B and C, section 825 and subsections 827B and D. Those are all part of your town tuition program. They are the pieces of law that essentially say how much tuition can be calculated. So we're notwithstanding all of that. And then any other provision of law to the contrary, just in case I have left something out. For fiscal years 28 and 29, only a school district that pays tuition for its resident students pursuant to chapter 21 and title 16 shall pay an amount not to exceed the average announced tuition of Vermont Union Elementary Schools and Union High Schools as applicable for fiscal year 27.
Thank you. The average announced tuition is determined, can you remind me by whom? Is that the state board or?
AOE, average announced tuition is literally an average of the announced tuition. Announced tuition has the calculation for how you get to announced tuition.
An announced tuition is determined by
AOE.
Oh, by AOE.
There is, I'm sorry, the net cost per pupil. AOE calculates. It's called net cost per pupil. I think it's just allowable tuition is what AOE is calling it now. In statute, it's net cost per pupil. So the highest amount a public school district can charge for tuition. And then the school districts can decide to charge anything at that or under.
Okay,
And that would be their announced tuition.
okay, that's what I
provide.
remember doing
Yeah.
as a school board member,
Yep.
because I thought school boards announced what their
Yes.
tuition was not.
But
Okay,
but they
and
have,
then they report it to the agency
Correct.
and the agency averages it.
correct.
Okay, so that average announced tuition is a concept for sort of public school tuition rates.
Yes, and that is under current law. Tuition for elementary schools is capped at the average announced tuition of Union Elementary Schools. And capped at the average announced tuition of Union High School. So these are just the concepts in current law. There are other scenarios where you can go above that with voter approval, or if you are a independent school meeting EQS, or you are a independent school serving as an area CTE center, you can charge more than the average announced tuition. But generally speaking, that's where the cap is.
Okay, so that was gonna be my question, because there are lots of things that we call tuition, but. So, paying CTE schools,
That's taken care of in a whole different
totally
chapter.
different, okay, and then the pre-K and, the special ed school, therapeutic schools, is that also in a separate?
Yes. Special education is under a separate chapter. Pre-K does live in chapter 21, and so if you decide to move forward with this language, we can add some clarifying language. I think it's clear that pre-K tuition is calculated differently, but it doesn't hurt to be more clear. This language as drafted, again, this is a policy choice. Career and technical education tuition is governed under chapter 37 in Title 16, with the exception of tuition to regional technical centers that are also approved independent schools that are serving as regional technical centers. That tuition is governed under chapter 21 and has been not withstood in this language that I've drafted. So again, that's a policy choice.
So who does this apply to?
Every school district that pays tuition.
So what happens to the allowable calculation?
I don't know what happens to the calculation. The cap at what a school district is allowed to pay would apply to both public and private schools.
So every public school that's a receiving school, every approved independent school,
Correct.
they would receive the average amount tuition.
Not to exceed the average announced tuition.
Okay.
Let's go through the whole thing, yeah.
Section
Digesting.
Section 3, and then section 828 in Title 16, which is the statute that controls which types of educational programs a school district can pay tuition to. And it amends the criteria for an approved independent school to be eligible to receive public tuition. So you'll see this is all current law. And we're adding that the approved independent school agrees that for the purposes of access to public records, the school is a public agency and shall comply with the Public Records Act, and provides an annual assurance to the State Board of Education signed by the head of school that no public funds were used to subsidize the tuition of private payer students.
Starting to feel a little beyond the scope of
Yeah, a little bit.
Is there any precedent for existing restrictions on tuition dollars? Do we have any restrictions?
78, or yeah, 79.
I mean, most of what is in 16 VSA 828 subdivision A2 is brand new from last year in Act 73. All of it, actually. Sure.
How do you define? Subsidize.
It's not defined here.
If I'm kid that just sits in my seat and learns. And I'm being charged the same rate as the kid sitting next to me who has a hard time sitting in the seat and learning and needs special help. In some way, I'm subsidizing his education because I'm taking less so that he can get more. Is that subsidizing, or is this looking at
I think,
it all equals?
I hear you on the ambiguity of the term.
Yeah.
If you were to move forward with this language and you wanted to refine what you are prohibiting, I think we can come up with some language beyond subsidize or that modifies subsidize or defines subsidize. But as drafted, I hear you on the ambiguity of the term.
Committee. I'm looking at people who are staring at the screen.
I think Ruth has a question.
Do you want to take this up? Or do you want to say this is more an education decision? I don't know.
I think a lot of this feels like it's not germane to the underlying bill.
That's kind
I
of,
want to make sure all schools are subject to the same prohibitions, that's all.
okay. Senator Brock, do you have anything before I get to Senator Hardy?
Just an overall impression that every time we discuss this, we add more complexity to it. I'm wondering how anybody's going to explain this to the public. That's an underlying
I just-
concern of everything we've done here today.
Started out as pretty simple. A lot ago. I'd like to keep it being less than 20 pages. Senator Hardy.
Yeah, I think if you could scroll previous, I think it's on page, the the bottom of page 1, maybe is. Yeah, so that one, that is just imposing a cap on tuition for all schools, public and private. Just like we're imposing a cap on all budgets for all public schools. So it seems germane, entirely germane
I think that piece is.
and fair.
Yeah.
So
And it's a cap on increase, not a cap. It's a cap on how much they can increase.
yeah. So it does seem that that's entirely relevant and also important because if school districts are gonna have to, cap their spending, part of the increase in cost for many school districts is the varying types of tuition, whether it's CTE or independent school or whatever it is. So being able to cap tuition, I think, is an important way to help school districts be able to meet the other kinds of caps, the other kind of cap.
Right.
So I'll just try to repeat, and I didn't say this clearly, but private and independent schools are not subject to the same amount of scrutiny and transparency in terms of their finances as public schools. So that's why I'm concerned, I'll repeat, as we are potentially degrading our public school system, private schools might be able to not suffer the same kind of, I don't want to use the word degradation. What's another, give me a synonym, another form of, sorry,
Constraint.
constraint. Because we don't know what they do with their endowments and their reserves, but potentially they could be used to kind of, I don't know, in ways that I personally can't even predict, but I'm worried that the gap is going to become greater in this, potentially in this scenario. And that was one of the things I was trying to do here, was to say, use your education dollar, your public education dollars for education. That's all.
Okay. I think the first section is money. You can't increase your tuition any more than you can increase the rest of it. then everybody else can increase with probably the same exceptions. I don't want to see somebody vote a new sports center next November or March and have those bond payments
Or a turf field.
or turn field or whatever. Or music theater, I mean, an art center, it's, I don't know, when it gets into making sure that private schools behave like, that's getting beyond the jurisdiction of this committee. We're a money committee. How schools use their endowments is I'm not comfortable going there,
Can I make a suggestion for this language that maybe would it just an assurance that public, instead of saying no public funds were used to subsidize tuition, private tuition, saying that public funds are only used to pay for the education of public school students or something like that. So
publicly
making,
tuition students.
flipping it so it's a positive statement about that this is public money, you're gonna use it for publicly funded students only,
Okay.
that kind of thing.
I mean, I still think it's not true, but, oh, where your point? Can, you go back up to section 2, Jeff? I don't have any problem with, having receiving schools, both public and independent, have to face, similar constraints that our operating public schools are gonna have to, deal with. But this is not the way to do it. I mean, public schools, they have their announced tuitions are all over the map. Their allowable tuitions are all over the map. Some of them are extremely high. I know all the public schools in my area that receive students are, they're receiving upwards of 27, 28, 29, $30,000. This would be to force them to take the average allowance would be an enormous hit. The average allowance is average. Not every public school, receiving school has the same. Some of them have very high poverty rates, and that's why they have a very high allowable tuition. This would really hurt. It would hurt the public schools in my area really badly that are receiving students. With that being said, I'm not opposed to having constraints on the growth of tuition for receiving schools, but this is not the way to do it.
Why can't we just say you can't exceed,
2.8%.
yeah, you can't exceed
Yeah.
the caps set in the allowable growth caps?
Well, it
Doesn't work that way.
doesn't, yeah, it doesn't, the math wouldn't work right.
Okay.
But I was thinking the same.
Exactly. I guess I would like to see some of that information about what, cause if they're a public school, they themselves have a budget that would be restricted by the allowable growth caps or 2.8%. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
but
if you just
that's
say,
revenue, that's
if they're
revenue.
functioning as a public school, they are a private school that is functioning as the public school in its area. Will be subject to the same growth restrictions.
I mean, I'll give you an example here, okay? Danville High School, the CCSU, which is Danville, Cabot, and Twinfield. Okay, their announced tuition in FY last school year was, I'm sorry, for this school year was $25,000.
mhm.
It's across, it's a SUI Okay,
Is that
those,
for high school or?
that's for high school,
Yeah.
age, yeah, that's right. They're allowable for last year, which is probably less than what they're allowed to do for this year. They're allowable that the charge is, Cabot is 30,701, Danville is 27,773. And Twinfield is 26,796. That's what they're allowed to charge for last year, and they should charge for last year. The average announced tuition is, I mean, significantly lower than that. It's far lower than what their announced tuition is. So those schools, I mean, I'm guessing they probably have, like Danville has 15 receiving students. You're talking probably pushing $100,000 of revenue hit for them by tying them to the average announced tuition. I think a percent growth, your tuition can't be more than some percent. That's fine. I think that's fine so that there's constraint on everybody, but I don't think the way to do it.
It sounds like this is going to make a complicated system more complicated.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be a 2-year reprieve for taxpayers. And if you can say somehow that you can't exceed the present year's tuition by any more than 3%, because it sounds like they're high spenders. That's it.
But they're not necessarily high spenders. I mean, these
Well,
are
they're,
these are
if we say-
non-weighted numbers.
if-
Right? They're non-weighted.
Okay, because we're saying
Yeah.
20,000 a student if you're charging 27.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I think NIPA or, works because what's gonna happen, right? We're not talking about FY 27 here. We're talking about FY 28, right? They're gonna know next budgeting season what their allowable was, what they charged the year before. And then they can build their tuition in FY 28 off of that number. They'd be under the same constraint as everybody else. I think that's how you do it. Not like
Can
this.
we live with that committee?
I would, sorry, go ahead. I mean, maybe I would like to see, have Julia talk about what since she's the numbers person, like if she has any data that could show us what this would mean, because
Okay.
I mean, I appreciate you're trying to come up with something that you can live with. I really do. And I do think it's fair if we're gonna cap one side of the system, we gotta cap the rest. So,
Yeah,
I just am wondering, I'd like to see more numbers to see what the impact would be.
okay, what numbers should I?
Well, I mean, I think Julia has information on the tuition rates and so I don't know if she has numbers on how many students districts are receiving. So like, I just like, what is the financial impact and is 2.8 the right number or is that unintentionally way too high or unintentionally way too low?
Okay, so Charlotte, can you just leave Julia an email when she gets in the morning, asking her if she can calculate the fiscal impact of limiting tuition increases to NIPA?
We just need to know is, how much money did sending districts send to approved independent and public receiving schools? And I think AOE knows that number.
Okay,
Yeah.
if you can give that
I'll help Charlotte with that.
to Charlotte, and that will, Julia can know when we put this back on the agenda.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
do you have any time pressure to get this bill out? Is that looming on you at all? I know you said tomorrow, Thursday, but.
I am being asked when it's coming
Fair enough.
out, and
I
I,
haven't told you.
but I want to make sure,
No,
I would like to get this as workable as possible.
Priority.
So,
May I ask a question if you expect
Yes.
language to me for tomorrow? Are you want to see language that caps what fiscal year's tuition rates at, to an increase of NEPA?
Yeah.
What fiscal year?
What,
Will grow from FY 27.
yeah, the same dates in the bill.
Yeah.
From 27 to 28, 29.
And I think the thing we really need to, I mean, for independent schools, it's really simple. They just have announced tuition, piece of cake. It's the public schools that are receiving, so it's actually a little more complicated because they are allowed to, well, AOE calculates their allowable. So when you're talking about tuition for a public receiving school, are you talking about their announced tuition, which is just kind of like their sticker price? Or are you talking about their allowable tuition, which is what they actually got paid?
I think it's what they actually got.
I think that's what
paid.
you want to do, yeah.
No, that's best saying.
My understanding of the way this works is that allowable tuition is the highest amount they can charge under state law as calculated by AOE. But their announced tuition is what they are actually charging.
We need to dig into that, then I'm different.
That's what the law says, so if something else is happening in the field, that would be excellent to know.
I'll sure it's that.
Cannot go up higher than 2.8% for the years 28 and 29.
I sense a agreement and consensus to mirror the cap on that allowable tuition rate to have a similar percentage cap.
Yeah, and we need a little more information on what's actually happening in the field versus what the law is. I think that's important.
Okay.
And that's the
I
clarity. that I was
could
talking about.
absolutely be wrong.
But we can't say, oh, it's too confusing and throw up our hands.
we
Like,
don't-
We can't, but what we can do is we can try to clarify.
yes.
We don't want to make it more confusing.
The difference between allowable and announced is a huge deal for public schools that are receiving. There's a huge delta between a lot of them. It makes a big difference.
figure it out.
I'm going to send the maker of the motion, the amendment proposer. See what you can find out.
Okay,
And see, the goal, I think, on everybody's is to have an equal cap on tuition, on public money being spent as tuition to private and independent schools, the same increase cap as is being put on the spending on public schools. So you can't say, well, we're going up 10% this year, and oh, by the way, your kids can all have a suite, a free indoor swimming pool and a ski pass if they come here. So I think we're trying to find equity in this. And think, since it is 5:30 and I have been trying to build up your tolerance. I'm trying to clear that board so we are not doing this until 10 o'clock at night. And get those bills out of here. So I'd like to get this one. It was the first one we got. We were asked to get it out quickly. I'm being asked, what are you doing with it? Now I know where we're going.
if we're in an austerity environment, I just don't think there should be
Yeah.
incentive for some to thrive.
No.
When others are in an austerity.
Right, and I don't think anyone is disagreeing with
I
that.
know.
I think it's making sure that in trying to get equity, we don't end up inadvertently putting somebody on a starvation diet.
No, agree.
Because what we want is for kids to be educated. Okay, thank you all. Let's go.